Hey, old man, folks around here don't like strangers, especially your kind. Those were the first words Officer Mason Hale threw across the quiet morning street in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, where humidity clung to the air like a warning, and the sun was still low enough to cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. His voice cut through the neighborhood like a blade, sharp enough for every porch sitter and dog walker within earshot to freeze for a second. Leonard Len Brooks, 79 years old, paused mid-step. He had been standing at the edge of a cul-de-sac, holding a weathered leather notebook and an old Canon film camera whose strap had nearly separated from years of use. His denim jacket was faded, elbows frayed, but he stood with a posture that suggested he had lived through storms much worse than the one forming in front of him. But still, he felt the sting. That sentence, that tone, that assumption. Black folks in Louisiana know it instantly. You hear it once, and your chest tightens. You hear it twice, and every memory of being underestimated comes rushing back. Len wasn't new to that feeling. He had learned to carry it quietly. He turned his head just enough to see Mason's silhouette reflected off the hood of the patrol car, young, tense, chin lifted like he needed the world to notice him. "Sir, let me see your hands," Mason barked, stepping out of the cruiser. His boots hit the pavement hard, like he was trying to make the ground itself respect him. Neighbors peeked through blinds. A man paused while loading groceries into his truck. A woman on a porch set down her iced coffee. Len slowly lowered the camera at his chest, palms open, steady. "I'm just taking notes," he said. His voice was deep, steady. Louisiana-born, seasoned with gravel and patience. Mason scoffed. "Notes? On what? People's houses?" His hand drifted toward the holster, a move meant to intimidate, not protect. Len didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the notebook slightly. The binding creaked. Mason stepped closer, shoulders tight. "You got no business here," Mason said. "This is a safe neighborhood. Folks pay taxes to keep it that way. So why don't you tell me exactly what you're doing before this becomes a bigger problem?" There it was again. That word. Problem. The one black men hear too often, even at 79. Len held his breath for half a second. Not out of fear, more like disappointment. He had walked these Louisiana streets long before this kid had learned how to salute. He knew every oak tree, every shotgun house, every stretch of road paved over communities that once belonged to people who looked like him. Len's eyes shifted toward the house he'd been observing. A pale blue home with a sagging porch and a mailbox hanging on one hinge. He'd been here before. The sight brought memories he didn't voice. Mason misread the silence. He stepped forward, invading Len's space. "Sir, I'm asking you nicely. This neighborhood doesn't need." Len finished the sentence for him quietly. "Doesn't need people like me around." The words slipped out not as anger, but as a tired truth. Mason blinked, thrown off. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Len replied. A couple across the street had stopped walking their dog. Their eyes jumped between the two men. A young teen recording the scene from the sidewalk flipped her phone sideways for a better angle, Mason noticed, and instead of cooling off, he bristled. "Put the notebook down," he ordered, voice louder, "and step away from the property." Len raised a brow. "This your first month on the job?" Mason stiffened. That hit harder than it should have. He'd been trying to earn respect from his squad for weeks. Every mistake was magnified. Every complaint felt like a threat to his badge. So he doubled down. "Sir, I'm not going to tell you again." Len exhaled through his nose a long, heavy breath that carried history. He didn't move. Not because he wanted to antagonize the young officer, but because he'd reached an age where you stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. Mason placed a hand on Len's arm too firm, too fast. Gasps came from the sidewalk. Phones lifted higher. The tension cracked open like a floorboard under pressure. In that moment, Len's notebook slipped from his hand pages, flipping open as it hit the pavement. A faded photograph fell out, drifting onto the asphalt. And the moment Mason saw that photo, something in him shifted, though he didn't understand why yet. But he would, because this wasn't just any old man. And Mason Hale was seconds away from realizing he'd just laid hands on someone he never should have underestimated. Someone whose name still echoed through Louisiana law enforcement. Something in that old photograph, something Officer Hale couldn't name, was about to flip this whole situation upside down. And in just a few minutes, he'd learned the truth about Leonard Brooks, a truth that would shake the entire parish and change his own future forever. Officer Mason Hale didn't notice the photograph at first. All he saw was an elderly black man refusing to back down, and that alone pushed every insecurity he had straight to the surface. "Step back!" Mason snapped, louder this time. His hand hovered too close to his holster for anyone's comfort. "You're trespassing! I can detain you for that!" Len Brooks didn't flinch. He simply looked at Mason the way older men look at young ones who haven't learned the difference between authority and ego. "Trespassing?" Len asked. "I'm standing on a public road, son." The word son hit Mason like a slap to the pride. His jaw tightened. "Don't call me that." Len sighed, tired, slow. The kind of sigh every black man over 50 has done 1,000 times in this country. The sound made the teen's recording fall silent for a moment. Mason finally noticed the photograph lying face up on the asphalt. He bent down, snatched it up, and gave it a quick glance. It was old creased around the edges, showing a group of uniformed officers in front of an old brick precinct. They stood shoulder to shoulder, serious, proud. And right there in the center was a younger Leonard Brooks, wearing a dark blue uniform with a badge that looked heavier than the rest. "Is this you?" Mason asked. Len didn't answer. He bent down slowly, picked up his notebook, brushed dirt off the cover, then looked Mason straight in the eyes. "That camera you knocked down belonged to the man standing next to me in that picture," Len said quietly. He didn't make it home after a call one night. The air shifted. Something about Len's voice, its weight, its history made a couple of neighbors step forward, no longer comfortable just watching. But Mason pushed through the moment. His pride refused to let him soften. "Look, whoever you used to be," he said, emphasizing the word like a blade, "you can't just walk around taking pictures of people's houses. Not in this neighborhood." Len's lips pressed into a thin line. "This neighborhood," he said slowly, "used to be a place where folks knew their neighbors. Now it's a place where an old black man holding a notebook is suspicious." "You're making this about race?" Mason barked. A young man on a porch muttered, "It's always about race out here," earning nods from others watching. But Mason ignored them. He stepped closer, too close, chest puffed. "Put your hands behind your back." Phones shot up instantly. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "He's really about to arrest that old man?" Len didn't move. And that's what set Mason off. "I said, put your hands, officer." Len's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the Louisiana air with a sharpness that froze Mason mid-sentence. "Young man," Len continued, "if you're going to put cuffs on me, you better have a reason stronger than whatever story you made up in your head." Mason's face reddened. He grabbed Len's wrist roughly. That was it. That was the moment everything changed. A neighbor, middle-aged, white, still wearing his work apron, stepped off his porch. "Officer, I don't think you should stay back," Mason barked, pointing at him. "This doesn't concern you." "It does when you're harassing an old man for nothing," the neighbor said, voice steady. More voices chimed in. "Ain't he the guy who volunteers at the church? He lives 2 streets down. Why's he treating him like a criminal?" The pressure mounted like August heat, but Mason refused to back down. He reached for his cuffs. "You're resisting an officer." Len stared at him, calm as still water. "Resisting?" he asked. "I'm standing still. You're the only one making noise." Mason didn't answer. He clipped one cuff around Len's right wrist. The crowd murmured, angry, confused, disgusted. "Man, this ain't right. That's somebody's grandfather. You really cuffing him? For what?" Len didn't fight. He let the first cuff hang loosely while the second one clicked in Mason's hand, ready to close. But before Mason could snap it shut, a long black SUV turned onto the street, moving slowly, deliberately. The kind of car that makes people step aside without knowing why. The crowd quieted. Mason didn't notice, but Len did. His eyes flicked toward the vehicle, then back to Mason. "You sure you want to finish that?" Len asked softly. Mason scoffed. "Yeah, I'm sure." And that's when the SUV rolled to a stop behind the patrol car, its engine idling low, doors locked, tinted windows reflecting the entire neighborhood. Every witness fell silent. Something was coming. Something Mason Hale was absolutely not ready for. And just when Officer Hale thought he still had control, that black SUV rolled onto the block slow, deliberate, carrying someone who knew the truth about Leonard Brooks. Someone who could end Hale's career with a single sentence. What happened when that door opened would change everything. The SUV door opened with a heavy thud that silenced even the cicadas buzzing in the Louisiana heat. Out stepped Deputy Commissioner Riley Vaughn, a tall black woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation that traveled faster than any patrol car in St. Landry Parish. Her presence alone made the air shift like the temperature dropped 5 degrees. Mason didn't notice her at first. He was still clutching the second handcuff, his grip tight on Len Brooks's wrist. But Len noticed, and for the first time that morning he let a faint, knowing smile touch the corner of his mouth. Vaughn walked straight toward them, each step measured, boot heels tapping against the pavement with authority carved from 30 years of service. "Mason Hale," she said without raising her voice. That was all it took. Mason jerked his head up, eyes widening. The handcuffs nearly slipped from his fingers. "Deputy Commissioner, ma'am, this isn't." She raised a hand, stopping his rambling cold. "Why is Mr. Brooks cuffed?" she asked, voice level as a plumb line. The crowd stirred at her words. Some gasped, some whispered. "Mr. Brooks? She knows him?" Mason blinked, utterly thrown. "Ma'am, you know this man?" Vaughn didn't answer him. She turned to Len, her expression softening with respect that ran deep. "Morning, Chief." "Chief." The word hit the street like a dropped match in dry grass. Mason's mouth fell open. A teen recording whispered, "Oh, he's done." A woman said, "Lord Jesus, that boy picked the wrong elder today." Len nodded once, quiet and dignified. "Morning, Riley." Riley, first name basis. Mason felt his stomach drop, but he still couldn't process it. "Chief, as in, chief of what?" he asked, voice cracking. Vaughn finally faced him again, and her eyes were sharp enough to pin him in place. "Former Police Chief Leonard Brooks," she said. "The man who built half the ethics guidelines you were supposed to study in the academy." A murmur rolled through the neighbors like a wave. "He trained 2 commissioners. He cleaned up the parish back in the 90s. My uncle said he saved his life once." Mason's face drained of color. He let go of the cuff instantly, but the damage was done. The metal bracelet still hung around Len's wrist, cold and humiliating. "Sir, I didn't know. You were just profiling," Vaughn said calmly. But her tone hit like a hammer. "You were just escalating for no reason. You were just ignoring every principle this department stands for." Someone filmed her, whispering, "This is gonna blow up online." Len lifted his wrist gently, examining the cuff without anger, just sadness. "I told him," Len said quietly. "I told him he was making a mistake." Mason swallowed hard, hands trembling. "Ma'am, he was taking pictures of houses. That's why And?" Vaughn asked. "Is that a crime?" "No, but neighbors said he looked suspicious." "Suspicious how?" Mason hesitated, and that silence said everything. Vaughn exhaled slowly, disappointment pulling her shoulders down for a second. "Officer Hale," she said, "do you know why Mr. Brooks takes pictures around this parish?" "No, ma'am. Because he volunteers for the Historical Preservation Committee. He documents old homes before they're demolished so communities can keep their history, something you clearly didn't bother to ask." Gasps. Mason's shoulders caved in. "And you know what else?" Vaughn added. He shook his head weakly. "Mr. Brooks was here because internal standards received multiple complaints about a young officer harassing residents in this area." Her eyes locked onto him like a spotlight. "We sent him to investigate. He was evaluating you." Mason felt the world tilt. "Me?" he whispered. "Yes," Vaughn said. "You." His chest tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning breeze. Len spoke then, calm but firm. "Son, sometimes people write their own report cards without realizing it." Mason's breathing quickened. "2 didn't mean to do anything wrong, I swear." Vaughn stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for the crowd to lean in. "You had every chance to de-escalate. You chose ego over judgment. And now we'll review your body cam to see whether this is a pattern." Phones caught every word. Len looked around at the neighbors, some ashamed, some vindicated, all watching. Then he looked back at Mason. "Young man," he said softly, "the badge doesn't give you character. It reveals it." Mason felt the weight of that truth in his bones. Behind them, the second door of the SUV opened, and 3 more internal standards officers stepped out, walking toward Mason and his fate. Officer Mason Hale's world was already collapsing in slow motion, but when the 3 internal standards officers stepped out of the SUV, it turned into a free fall. Their uniforms were darker than regular patrol charcoal gray with silver shoulder patches, the kind of uniform that didn't need to announce power. Everyone who'd ever worn a badge knew exactly what it meant. Trouble. Career-changing trouble. They approached quietly, forming a semicircle around Mason. The neighbors instinctively backed away, creating space the same way people do when they sense a storm rolling in. Deputy Commissioner Vaughn folded her arms. "Officer Hale, stand over here," she said, nodding toward the edge of the driveway. Her voice wasn't angry. That made it worse. When a superior stays calm, it means the decision is already made. Mason moved stiffly, like every step pulled more weight onto his shoulders. His chest rose and fell in short, unsettled breaths. Len Brooks remained exactly where he was, one hand still cuffed, the Louisiana heat glinting off the metal. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just watched with the same level gaze he'd used to command precincts long before Mason was born. "You're free to remove the cuff, Mason," Vaughn said. His fingers shook as he unlocked it. When the metal clicked open, Len rubbed his wrist, not out of pain, but out of memory. He had cuffed people with those same models decades ago, some guilty, some not. He never forgot which was which. Vaughn motioned to internal standards. "Run his body cam." An officer tapped the side of Mason's vest. The small device beeped, and a feed appeared on a tablet. They scrubbed back through the morning, the audio crisp enough for the crowd to hear every word Mason had thrown at Len. "You're kind, suspicious, you're trespassing, put your hands behind your back," each line cut deeper than the last. Some neighbors shook their heads. The teen recording exhaled hard, whispering, "Man, this is ugly." The clip rolled until the moment Mason grabbed Len's wrist. Vaughn lifted a hand. Pause. The screen froze on Mason's grip-tight, unnecessary, humiliating. "That," Vaughn said, pointing to the frozen frame, "is where you failed as an officer." Mason swallowed. "Ma'am, I was trying to do my job." "No," she replied. "You were trying to win a moment." The words hung in the humid air, heavy as cinder blocks. Len stepped forward slightly, not to defend Mason, but to speak truth. "That camera you knocked out of my hands," he said quietly, "belonged to a friend of mine from 1984, a man who taught me how to see this parish for what it really is. A man who died wearing the same uniform you're wearing right now." Several people in the crowd lowered their phones. "You thought I was here scouting houses," Len continued, "but I was gathering photos for a local archive project, trying to preserve the homes folks around here grew up in before they get torn down and forgotten." Mason's chest tightened, regret twisting his insides. Vaughn stepped beside Len, her voice carrying authority without raising volume. "Mr. Brooks wasn't just the police chief," she said. "He restructured this entire parish after the floods in '92. He instituted community-first policing. He solved cases nobody else could crack. You're standing in a neighborhood he fought to protect when half of you were still in grade school." Mason felt the truth hit him like a punch, his hands curling into fists, not in anger, but shame. "So why was he alone?" he whispered, barely audible. Len answered, "Because sometimes, to understand what's broken, you go see it yourself." His eyes met Mason's. "And today, I saw you." A low ripple traveled through the crowd. Internal standards stepped forward. One officer held a clipboard, another had a small device ready to take Mason's statement. The third watched him closely, assessing everything: breathing, posture, readiness to argue or accept. Vaughn spoke again. "Officer Hale, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Hand over your badge and firearm." Gasps echoed. A woman covered her mouth. Someone muttered, "Damn." Mason froze like he'd been struck. His badge wasn't just metal, it was the only thing he'd worked for since he was 18. His lips parted like he wanted to fight back, but then he looked at Len. Really looked, and something inside him cracked open. Slowly, mechanically, he unpinned his badge and placed it in Vaughn's outstretched hand. Then he handed over his Glock, the weight leaving his palm a little too easily. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vaughn said, softer this time, "You can come back from this, Hale." but only if you're willing to learn. Len nodded once, approving the message without speaking. Mason blinked hard, eyes stinging, chest tight. Not from fear, from realization. He had crossed a line he wasn't ready to admit existed. And now everyone saw it. "Hi, friend. Before we continue, I need your help. We've noticed the channel losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and helps us keep delivering great content for you. Your support means everything. Comment your city or country below. Let's see how far this community reaches." Thank you. Now, back to the story. The street in St. Landry Parish stayed quiet in that heavy, humid way Louisiana does when everyone's holding their breath at the same time. Officer Mason Hale stood there without his badge, without his gun, and without the certainty he'd walked onto this block with just 15 minutes earlier. For the first time all day, he looked small, not weak, not beaten, just human. Deputy Commissioner Riley Vaughn placed Mason's badge into a slim evidence pouch, sealing it with a firm press. Internal Standards officers circled him, not threatening, but deliberate, trained to watch a man who was finally starting to see himself clearly. Neighbors whispered from porches and driveways, but the tone had shifted. The judgment had softened into something else, curiosity, maybe even sympathy. Nobody likes to watch a young man lose his future, even when he caused the fall himself. Len Brooks stepped back from the crowd, giving Mason room. He adjusted the strap of his broken camera, cracked casing hanging loose. Even like that, the camera didn't look weak. Just seasoned same as him. Mason cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, I didn't mean..." Len held up a hand. "Don't explain," he said gently. "Just listen." The words carried weight, not forceful, not sharp, but steady. The voice of a man who'd lived through things Mason couldn't imagine. "You saw an old black man with a notebook and you assumed I was trouble," Len continued. "That didn't start today. That belief didn't come from nowhere. But it's your job to unlearn it." Mason swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I thought I was doing what officers are supposed to do," he said quietly. "No," Len replied. "You were doing what scared men do. Big difference." Vaughn didn't interrupt. Internal Standards didn't move. Everyone understood the importance of that moment because sometimes the real accountability comes before the paperwork. Len took a slow step forward, the kind that made you forget he was 80 next spring. "You know why I came out here alone?" he asked. Mason shook his head. "Because this parish has been dealing with complaints about new officers who think power is proof of manhood. So I went to check myself same way I used to." Len tapped his notebook. "And what I found was a young man who thinks raising his voice makes him right." Mason's eyes lowered to the ground. Len sighed, the kind that carried both disappointment and hope. "You can recover from this, son. Plenty have. But only if you're willing to see the man in the mirror and stop pretending the badge is who you are." For a moment, Mason didn't move. Then he spoke not with confidence, not with excuses, but with something new in his voice, something quieter. "I don't want to be that guy," he said. "I swear I don't." Len nodded. "Then don't be." It was simple advice, but it hit like gospel. Vaughn stepped forward finally. "Mr. Brooks, thank you. We'll take it from here." But Len wasn't done. "And one more thing," he said, turning to Mason. The young officer lifted his head, bracing for whatever came next. "You owe this neighborhood an apology. Not because you got caught, but because you made people here feel unsafe when that was supposed to be your job. It wasn't said with shame, it was said with expectation, a higher standard." Mason turned to the small crowd neighbors, teens, parents, retirees, all waiting. He wet his lips, every part of him shaking. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I handled this wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that, Mr. Brooks, or treated you like you didn't belong here." Len nodded slowly. Not approval acknowledgement. The first brick in a long rebuilding process. The Internal Standards officers motioned for Mason to step aside for formal processing. He obeyed quietly, moving with a different energy now, not defensive, not angry, just humbled. As he walked past Len, he hesitated. "You were really the chief?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Len gave a small smile. "Once upon a time. Back when your daddy was probably still in school." Mason managed a weak, embarrassed laugh. Two didn't know. Len looked him in the eyes, firm but kind. And that's the part you need to change, he said. Start knowing. Start asking. Start seeing. Mason nodded, swallowing the lesson whole. Then he followed internal standards toward the SUV, leaving behind the version of himself that had walked onto this street. The neighbors drifted back into their homes, murmuring about what they'd witnessed. Some shook Len's hand before leaving. Others thanked Vaughn. A few hugged each other, shaken but relieved. And Len? He stood alone on the sidewalk for a moment, staring at the old blue house across the street. The one he came to document. The one full of stories worth remembering. He lifted his broken camera, turned it over in his hands, and whispered something only he could hear. Then he closed his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and walked slowly down the block, just an old man in a Louisiana morning, carrying history like a second heartbeat. The sun had climbed higher over St. Landry Parish, laying a warm, heavy glow across the neighborhood. The crowd had dispersed, but the weight of what happened lingered in the air like the scent of rain right before a storm breaks. Deputy Commissioner Riley Vaughn remained on the sidewalk with her internal standards officers, speaking quietly into her radio. Mason Hale sat in the back of the gray SUV, not cuffed, but folded in on himself. Shoulders drawn tight, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing. Len Brooks watched all of it from a few steps away, leaning lightly on the camera strap slung across his shoulder. The old Canon's casing was cracked, the lens chipped, but he held it the way a man holds a keepsake that's worth more than money. Vaughn finished her call and walked toward him. "You sure you're all right, Chief?" she asked, her voice softer now, age-old respect woven through every syllable. Len gave a small nod. "I've had worse days." Vaughn exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from her brow. "I know, but you shouldn't have to put up with this nonsense in your own parish." Len's eyes drifted back toward the old blue house across the street, the reason he'd come out here in the first place. "You know why I kept my old badge out of sight," he said. "People treat you different when they know who you used to be. I was out here to see this place for what it really is now, not what folks pretend it is." "And what did you see?" Vaughn asked. Len hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, because the truth always carried weight. "I saw a neighborhood that forgot how to trust," he said. "People peeking through blinds, afraid to speak up. Kids recording because they know proof is the only way folks believe them. A young officer carrying fear he doesn't understand. And a parish that's getting real good at hiding the cracks." Vaughn nodded slowly. "You think it's getting worse?" Len hummed low in his throat. "It ain't new. It's just louder now." She let the silence sit, the way seasoned cops do when a truth hits close to home. After a moment, two internal standards officers approached. "Commissioner, we're ready," one of them said. Vaughn turned to Len. "He's not broken, just misdirected." Len adjusted his hat. "Most young men are. And he's willing to go through remediation," she continued. "The full program. Ethics, bias intervention, community immersion. It's not short. It's not easy." "It shouldn't be," Len replied. They both glanced toward the SUV. Through the tinted window, Mason sat motionless, staring straight ahead. For the first time since the ordeal began, he didn't look angry or defensive. He looked reflective, humbled, human. Vaughn crossed her arms. "Do you want to file formal action, Chief? The department will back you." Len shook his head before she even finished the question. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not here to take away a young man's future. I'm here to help him fix it." Vaughn breathed out in relief, though she tried not to show it. "You sure?" "He made mistakes," Len said. "Plenty of them. But punishment without guidance don't heal a community. It just makes another enemy." Vaughn almost smiled. "Always the teacher." "Always," Len echoed. The passenger door of the SUV opened, and Mason stepped out hesitantly. He wasn't the same man who had barked orders an hour earlier. His shoulders were lowered. His face was drained. Even the Louisiana heat felt like it pressed differently on him now. He approached Len slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mr. Brooks, I don't have the words to—" "You don't need the words," Len cut in gently. "You need the effort." Mason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I want to learn," he said quietly. "I want to do better." "To really do." Len studied him for a moment, reading sincerity the way only seasoned elders can. "Good," Len said. "Then start by listening. Listening to people who ain't like you. Listening to folks who've lived through things you can't see. Listening before assuming. You do that long enough, you start to understand the real job. Mason blinked back, the sting in his eyes. Can I make this right? You're already on the road, Len replied. Just keep walking. Vaughn stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Officer Hale? You'll begin the remediation program this week, she said. 3 months minimum. Community hours. Training renewal. And you'll check in with Mr. Brooks periodically as part of your evaluation. Mason froze. With him? Len chuckled softly. Don't look so scared, son. I don't bite. Mason's shoulders eased just a little. The internal standards team prepared to leave. Vaughn shook Len's hand before returning to the SUV. As the engine started, the last of the neighbors who lingered gave Len grateful nods before heading home. Soon, the street returned to normal kids riding bikes again, a man mowing his lawn, someone grilling sausages down the block. But something had shifted here today. Something important, something earned. Len looked back at the cracked camera in his hands. He whispered, "We still got work to do." Then he tucked the camera close to his chest, turned toward the next house on his list, and kept walking, one steady, deliberate step at a time. The afternoon sun settled heavy over St. Landry Parish, stretching long shadows across the cracked sidewalks as Len Brooks made his slow walk back toward his truck. The neighborhood was quieter now, calmer, like everyone was exhaling at the same time after a storm finally passed. Every step Len took felt like revisiting pieces of a life he'd lived once already. The badge he no longer wore, the streets he once protected, the people he'd spent decades trying to serve, even when they didn't always serve him back. His old camera swung gently against his chest with each step, cracked but not broken. Kind of like him. Kind of like this whole place. Behind him, the internal standards SUV rolled down the block, carrying Officer Mason Hale into a future he didn't expect, but maybe the one he needed. Mason looked out the window as they passed Len, and for a second, their eyes met. Not fear. Not anger. Something humbler. Something honest. Len raised 2 fingers in a small gesture of acknowledgement. Mason nodded once before the SUV turned the corner and disappeared. The street fell quiet again. Len stopped at the blue house, the one he'd come to document. He lifted the camera, thumb brushing the chipped shutter button. Through the cracked lens, the house looked warped, its edges bent like a memory being pulled in 2 directions. But the essence was still there. History always finds a way to show itself, even through damage. He took the picture. A soft click echoed down the block. Then Len lowered the camera, eyes drifting across the neighborhood, the porches, the oaks, the mailboxes leaning slightly after years of storms. He saw the same place he'd defended as chief, the same families he used to wave to during patrols. But today he'd seen something else too, a reminder that progress doesn't arrive like a parade. It arrives messy. Uneasy. One human being at a time. He whispered, almost to himself, "We still got a long road." A wind rolled through the trees, rustling leaves like an answer. Len walked back to his truck, opened the door, and placed the damaged camera gently on the passenger seat. Then he sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the weight of the day settle into something that felt finally like hope. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind you earn. Before starting the engine, he looked once more at the homes around him. This was the parish he grew up in. The parish that taught him to stand tall, the parish that taught him to survive, to forgive, and sometimes when it mattered most, to let again. He turned the key. The truck rumbled to life, old but reliable, same as him. And as Len drove away, the story he left behind wasn't just about a confrontation or a mistake. It was about accountability, healing. And what happens when one elder in a broken world decides to keep teaching, even when nobody asked him to? Because that's how communities change. Not through speeches, not through headlines, but through moments, small, painful, transformative moments like the one that unfolded on that Louisiana street. Moments that remind us who we are and who we still have the chance to be. Hi, friend. If you made it this far, I truly thank you. Before you go, I need your help. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel. It's free, it supports us, and it helps us keep creating stories that speak to our community. Comment your city or country below so we can see where our listeners are tuning in from. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Now let's keep growing together.